Welcome to the Bulwark Podcast. I'm Charlie Sykes. In the first full day of the winter of 2020, I find myself grasping for just sort of positive things to hold on to this particular year. So can I just mention what the highlight of my day was yesterday? I mean, this is kind of inside baseball, but I mean, it's kind of a thing for for me. I of course, besides doing the Bulwark, am a contributor to MSNBC, which is its own strange trip in and of itself. And you may have heard about this, but Leslie Jones, the former cast member of SNL, started to do this sort of online, on air riff on people who show up on TV. And so it's kind of like Room Rater. I don't know. Again, this is kind of insider stuff. That if you do these cable hits, there's a Twitter handle called Room Rater that says, how they like your room, and 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10, 10 out of 10. And Leslie Jones has started doing this, but with a little bit of an edge. And last night it was my turn. There I am, sitting in my kitchen in front of my fireplace, and this is Leslie Jones's riff while I'm talking.
What in the story time book shit is this here? That fireplace, homie. Did he come out the fireplace, though? That's what I'm trying to figure out. I like the pine cones. Not many people like pine cones. But I lived by woods that had a whole bunch of pine cones. And always used to make projects out of pine cones during the Christmas time. So I like a good pine cone. But it seemed very funny how he placed himself in front of that fireplace like that. That's great.
Okay, for the record, I did not come out of the fireplace, but if any of you want a story, we could probably arrange that. It might involve dogs and reindeer. So our special guest today is one of our contributors, Robert Tracinski, a longtime conservative commentator. Welcome back on the podcast, Robert.
Hi, thanks for having me on, Charlie.
Okay, before we get to that, though, can I just make a little pitch for Bulwark Plus? This podcast is free and it's going to remain free. But we also have Bulwark Plus, and it's membership. And if you sign up for Bulwark Plus, you have access to a suite of other podcasts, which are very, very cool, as well as our daily newsletters. And I was thinking about that this morning because I get up about 5 a.m. and I start writing the newsletter, trying to, my take on the day, to point out things that I think are salient in a time when it's very, very hard to keep up with the news cycle. And my newsletter today is the Mad King's Endgame. Every day brings a new humiliation. And I was thinking about it when I was lying in bed last night, to give you a sense of how badly my life sucks. And two things hit me that right now, and I want to talk to you about this, Robert. Two things hit me. Number one, there is now a non-zero chance that Donald Trump will refuse to leave the White House on January 20th. I'm not saying it's possible. I'm just saying I'm not saying it's probable. I'm saying it's possible because Trump has gone full Mad King, and he's raging against his enemies. He's turning against against all of his closest folks, and he's talking about military-like coups. Okay, so that's number one. But the flip side is, this guy is losing big time. His world is imploding around him. And his presidency is going to end in close to the worst possible, if not the most, worst possible way. It will end in disgrace. You can see the insiders edging toward the door. And what's really striking about it is I know that we can, get really, upset about watching the way he's attacking our democratic norms. But from his point of view, I mean, the Mad King is experiencing a new humiliation every single day. So if you subscribe to my newsletter, you got my rundown on it, and maybe it's a little bit of an antidote to gnawing coup dread, because I mean, look, there's no longer the remotest possibility that any court in the country is going to overturn the votes of any state. Not a single state legislature is going to vote to disenfranchise its state's voters. The military is not going to obey any order to impose martial law. And there is zero chance that Congress will actually overturn the Electoral College on January 6th. And on almost a daily basis, he has one of his loyalists turn on him, whether it's Bill Barr or Pat Robertson or Mitch McConnell or Vladimir Putin. I mean, it's like, wow. So please consider, subscribing to Bulwark Plus, because we really try to add some value to it. And as I was trying to do the math here, I think a Bulwark Plus membership is something like $10 a month, and for that you get more than 20 newsletters. So it was like 50 cents a newsletter. And so I was thinking about that and saying, am I going to give people 50 cents worth of value this morning? And I think so. So Robert Tracinski, should we talk about the degree of alarmism and how alarmed we should be as the Mad King sits in the White House lashing out at everybody? Because it feels, well, I mean, it feels very sort of, last days for this guy, and he's surrounded by the worst crackpots, and everybody else is headed for the exits. Do you have the same take on that, or do you have a different take?
No, absolutely. Well, I have a somewhat different take, but I agree with you that at this moment he does have that sort of sad and pathetic vibe to him. I mean, one of my little as an Ayn Rand guy, as an objectivist, as someone who's in favor of her philosophy, one of my bugbears is the misuse of the word selfish, right? Because she defended the virtue of selfishness, the idea of rational self-interest. So I heard somebody talk about Trump as being selfish by refusing to concede in the election. And I thought, well, what's really self-interested? How is it in his interest to reenact the same humiliation over and over again every day, right? Yeah,
Yeah, this is not in his self-interest. That's a good point. Yeah.
and instead of losing the election once, he's going to lose it 75 different. I don't know how many days there are in between, but he's going to lose it like 90 different times in between election day and inauguration day.
No, that's true. And I mean, we already have, I think it was a Fox News poll said that 42% of Americans think that he will be remembered as the worst president in American history. And this last 30 days is not going to help his reputation.
No, it certainly isn't. He loses the last chance he has to sort of leave in a dignified way. However, so that's part of the perspective, and I'm generally an optimist and think things are going to turn out better than we fear. However, where I want to get alarmed, though, is that I think it's not about this election. It's not about
Yeah.
overturning this election result. It's about the next election. Because what I'm concerned that he's doing is by digging in for 2.5 solid months, digging in and demanding. It's not just that he doesn't want to acknowledge the election result. It's that he's demanding everybody else come out and swear their oath of loyalty to him. He's going to probably push it to the point where there's this January 6th vote where the House has to vote to accept the election results, and he's probably going to get a bunch of people to throw a wrench into that. And it's not going to work because, they can say, oh, we challenge it. And there's going to be a vote where they challenge it. And then, the House will vote in the Senate and there's a Democratic majority and enough Republicans who will peel off. So he's going to, Trump is going to lose again for the 90th time. So it's
probably overwhelmingly in the Senate. I mean, the worst case scenario from my point of view would be that he would only get like 70 votes against him. It could be like the vote last night. It could be like 91-7.
Well, and that's the concern here is that what he's doing is by making everybody go on the record and then using the pressure of his fanatical base, because that's the thing he's had all along is he's had the fanatical base, and anybody who's in the media business knows what these sort of flying monkeys look like, right? And that there are certain people who have the flying monkeys and certain people who don't, right? Mitt Romney, you criticized Mitt Romney and people didn't show swarming up around you saying, how do you dare possibly criticize Mitt Romney? Everybody understood why you criticized.
The Mormons were very polite about it.
Yes, they are. And
they would make you cookies and want to sit down and talk to you about the misunderstanding. Trump, it's the full flying monkeys flinging feces in your face.
Right. Well, and there's certain people who have that, like Ron Paul. There's always this like trade-off we do. Is like if I mention Ron Paul and criticize Ron Paul, I make the point I want to make, but on the other hand, is it worth it for what's going to happen? On my Twitter mentions for the next 3 days. Because he has those sort of flying monkeys, and that terrifies politicians. And so what he's trying to do is by summoning them for, the whole period of the interregnum, for the whole period from the election to the inauguration, every day he's got them out there pressuring Republican politicians to come out and say this election was rigged, it was fraudulent, and Donald Trump is the real winner, and we're going to challenge it. And if you don't say that, then you get a lot of pressure put on you. And so my concern is what happens if, and I don't think that's going to end in Inauguration Day. I think he's going to continue that. And that's his strategy to run again in 4 years.
Well, but see, going back to your what's in his self-interest, because as he turns on everyone, as he becomes more isolated and crazy, I think he's reducing the chances that that's going to be successful as well. I mean, we're seeing now he's turning on, he's mad at Pence, he's mad at his chief of staff, he's ripping his White House counsel, Pat Cipollone. He threw, Bill Barr under the bus last week, Secretary Pompeo, and last night he's lashing out at Mitch McConnell.
Okay, well, there you are being an optimist, but I see that I may be fighting the last war, but I'm sort of conditioned by what happened in 2015, 2016, where a lot of us thought, well, the Trump guy is the flash in the pan. It's not going to happen. There's no way he's going to win. It's a celebrity stunt. And then, we were not alarmed enough. And I'm overcompensating now by being perhaps too alarmed.
Okay, I understand what you're saying. We've said this so many times before, but right now, I mean, Trump is simply too crazy for the crazy. I mean, he's demanding too much loyalty, except for the most deranged and the corrupt. I mean, that thing with Bill Barr yesterday was amazing. I mean, think about, we're talking about Bill Barr, who's supposed to be his Roy Cohn. He comes out and the bus that he was thrown under, he throws the whole bus back right on top of Donald Trump. I mean, he says, I'm not going to appoint a special counsel to investigate election fraud. I'm not going to appoint a special counsel looking to Hunter Biden. No basis to seize voting machines. Looks like it's the Russians behind this massive hack. I mean, this was as complete an FU to Donald Trump as Bill Barr could have delivered. He understood that those were heat-seeking missiles into the things that Trump is obsessed about. So I kind of wonder what was the breaking point for somebody like Bill Barr? And all of these other guys you can see are looking around and going, we got to get out of here. So if there's a breaking point for Bill Barr, there's a breaking point for everybody. And then, okay. So since we're reliving our trauma of 2015, 2016, there was also the indication that God has told Pat Robertson, never mind. Remember Pat Robertson, America's evangelist?
Oh, I remember very well.
He told his audience that God had told him that Trump would be reelected. Did you hear what he said yesterday?
I did not.
Let us, Mr. Tracinski, let us luxuriate in the new Pat Robertson analysis of where we are at now.
I think it's all over. I think the Electoral College has spoken. I think the Biden corruption has not totally been brought to fruition, but it doesn't seem to be affecting the Electoral College. Nope. And I don't think the Supreme Court is going to move in to do anything.
Nope.
And I think we're going to see a President Biden, and I also think we'll be seeing a President Kamala Harris not too long after the inauguration of President Biden. With all his talent and the ability to raise money and draw large crowds, the president still lives in an alternate reality. He really does. People say, well, he lies about this, that, and the other, but no, he isn't lying. To him, that's the truth. He had the biggest crowd on Inauguration Day. He had more people than ever. He was the most popular people. He saved NBC, but with The Apprentice, you go down the line of things that really aren't true, and people kept pointing to them. But because they loved him so much and he was so strong for the evangelicals were with him all the way. But there was something about him that was good, that God placed him in that office for the time. He's done a marvelous job for the economy. But at the same time, he is very erratic, and he's fired people, and he's fought people, and he's insulted people, and it keeps going down the line. So it's a mixed bag. And I think it would be well to say, you've had your day, and it's time to move on.
Whoa. Okay.
Yeah, when you're too reality based for Pat Robertson, that's something.
Now, say Pat Robertson's got to be what, about 120 years old, but he's been paying attention. This is the interesting thing. He's noticed all this stuff, and he goes, okay, he's not lying. The guy actually lives in an alternative reality. Okay, when Pat Robertson says you are living in an alternative
Right.
reality, wow.
Yeah,
So
I think
it's
that's a great point actually, though, about Trump not lying. Because I always think when I hear Trump, I always think of the great line from Seinfeld where um, George Costanza is giving advice to Jerry on how to lie, and he says, "Remember, it's not a lie if you believe it." And
I don't know. That's important. So I want to just go back to something you said because I think it's important for listeners to understand this. And I saw that you retweeted Josh Barrow, who said the Republicans really want to avoid a vote on January 6th, up or down on the Electoral College, because that's a nightmare vote. Because they'd essentially have to choose between, upholding the Constitution and bringing on the flying monkeys. I mean, that's why they dread it, because it shouldn't be a courageous vote, right? It shouldn't be a
no,
nightmare vote to do what every United States senator in the history of the country basically has done, which is to acknowledge that if you win the Electoral College, you become president of the United States. I mean, until right now,
well,
that had never been a difficult vote.
and I was going to say that. What about the Confederates? But they acknowledged that Lincoln won. They just said, "Well,
They
then we'll
did.
leave the Union." Right?
They were cucks compared to these guys. Oh, that's a great point. 1861. They waited until after they had voted, counted the Electoral College votes for Abraham Lincoln before they seceded.
Right.
So this is a nightmare vote because of the flying monkey. So you what does Mike Pence do? I mean, this guy, talk about being screwed. Axios has this great report where Trump thinks everybody around him is weak, stupid, or disloyal. That apparently the standard is that if you're not in favor of demanding that the legislatures overturn the Electoral College and seizing the voting machines, that you're a complete cuck. But Pence's role in January 6th is looming large in Trump's mind, and of course, as vice president, he presides over the
Mhm.
joint session of Congress. And according to Axios, Trump would view Pence performing his constitutional duty, doing what he's supposed to do, validating the election result. Trump would regard that as the ultimate betrayal. Pence is totally screwed here, isn't he?
Oh, he is. He is because he's in too deep on supporting Trump to ever sort of get that stink off of him. But at the same time, he also, I think, I don't know. I don't know Pence that well, and maybe he has surprised me as being. I thought he was much more of a conventional, safe politician.
Yeah.
But I also think he's not the kind of guy who's then going to want to go down in the history books as the guy who disrupted the recognition of the Electoral College. So I think he is. I don't think he's going to do what Trump wants him to do. And so he's going to be, the big villain for the Trump people. At the same time, he's never going to get rid of the stink of having supported and been a loyal supporter of Trump up to now.
Yeah, I think you're right. There comes a point at which, and I think we've seen this again and again, that when it's just a cheap tweet or a press conference or showing up at a Charlie Kirk conference, people can strut their stuff. But when you have to have skin in the game legally, Republicans have done the right thing, right? I mean, they've signed the certifications, and so just like they did in Georgia, or the governor of Arizona did, or the officials in Michigan, that they're not going to violate the law. Yeah, Mike Pence does not want the image of himself presiding over overturning an election to be his legacy, because that's what it would be. On
Well,
the other hand,
I,
that he's excommunicated if he does it. If he does the right thing. See, that is how utterly screwed up the Republican Party is, that people who do the bare minimum of their constitutional duty are now, castigated.
well, that's why I have a more pessimistic take right now. Partly because it's my reflex from 4 years ago, but also because I really have a question of how does the Republican Party come back from this? How do you have this period, this long period? I don't think it's over yet. I think Trump's going to continue to do this from out of office for as long as he can wield that influence. We can. The question is how long
Okay.
will that be? But how does the Republican Party bounce back from something like that? It's such a massively corrupting event that I think it's 10 years of darkness is your punishment for it.
Well, except they haven't been punished for it so far. I mean, they're sitting there going, We put up with 4 years of this absolute dysfunctional presidency, and we're poised to win control of the House. We still control the United States Senate. Things are good. We didn't lose any state legislatures. We're going to be able to control gerrymandering again. And looking forward, they don't need to be a majority party. They don't need to convince voters. They can still lose national elections by 5-6 million votes to win the Electoral College. So I'm guessing Republicans, they don't feel there's even a need to have an autopsy, right? Because everything's great.
Yeah, actually, I noted that it's the Democrats who have announced they're having an autopsy of the election. That post-mortem, I think they called it, where because they had one of the most unpopular Republican presidents in a long time, and they couldn't gain seats. They lost seats in the House. They couldn't gain back the Senate. If you have those, I mean, consider look at the majority they had when Barack Obama got elected, right?
I know. Yeah.
They had a huge
Super
gain. They
majority.
had a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate, and now they can't get a majority in the Senate. Yeah, I think I think this is the punishment for the Democrats for being for the Black Lives Matter thing, and for basically being the party of the extreme left and the party of chaos, and for not standing up to their nutcases. I mean, that's the thing we got to
But
look
they
at.
did stand up to their nutcases. I mean, you could argue that, of course, they're not the party of the far left. They're the party of Joe Biden, and Joe Biden was very forceful in standing up against the street violence.
Well, I think he was, but the thing is that down the ballot, and I think they were in many ways tolerant of, and not just the Democratic politicians, but also sort of the left of center media. They spent a lot of time making excuses for riots, and remember all the stuff of mostly peaceful protests.
Mostly peaceful.
Yeah. Or what is it? Rioting breaks out as violence breaks out as a peaceful protest intensifies.
I do think that see, this is something that people on progressives, I do think, need to step back and say, do you understand how you sound sometimes? In your own head, you think you're saying X, but this is the way it plays in the parts of the country that will determine things like who controls Congress and who controls the presidency. And this was something that I tried to emphasize over and over again during the election, and they were able to pull it out. But I still think that there are folks that don't who will I will get lots of emails from people explaining that no, defund the police really is a good idea. What defund the police really means is, and my point is, look, if you're explaining it in rural North Carolina, you're losing the election. This is how you will lose all of this. And so anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in Virginia's 7th district, which is a rural district. That's part of the suburbs of Richmond, and then out here in the boondocks.
Who's your congressman?
Spamberger.
Okay, go ahead.
She's a Democrat. It's interesting. So this was the district that existed. It was created to reelect Eric Cantor forever. Right, he was going to be congressman from the 7th district to the end of time. We had the Tea Party rebellion, and we got this libertarian guy, Dave Bratt. Yeah, because he was my congressman, and I liked him, and I can't remember his name all of a sudden. Sic transit gloria mundi.
Well, this is the fate of all these people. Just mentioning, going Dave Bratt. Yeah.
In the 2018, when there was this backlash, especially in the suburbs, and we got enough of the south suburbs of Richmond for this to sway our district. There was this backlash against the Republicans, and Spamberger, a moderate Democrat, an actual real, honestly, just moderate Democrat, got elected here in this district that was basically created to elect Republicans until the end of time. And that was a real sort of indication. And she very, very, very narrowly won re-election this time. And she went on this conference call, and it kind of makes me like her, even though I didn't vote for her. She went on this conference call with the Congressional Democratic Caucus after the election, and starts shouting at them about how never use the word socialism ever again, and knock it off with this defund the police. I almost lost my re-election because of defund the police.
Yeah,
so it has an impact. Yeah. It has an impact in places where the police are not going to be defunded, right? It has an impact in places where these policies are not actually going to be implemented, but where they serve as an effective bogeyman of look what these horrible Democrats want to do.
Well, let's go back to where the Republicans are right now. And I think you've already answered one of the questions that I was hoping to address, which was I keep getting asked the questions. Well, why are Republicans not standing up against this? Where was the pushback among elected Republican officials after the reports that Donald Trump is meeting in the Oval Office and discussing the possibility of military coups?
Right.
And my answer is they're just waiting the guy out. At this point, they're keeping their head down. They're just waiting for it to be over. And I think that's because they just don't want to unleash the flying monkeys. But to your point about what happens to the Republican Party going forward, you look at some of the people coming on board who are going to be very high profile. The Democrats had, the squad. Think about some of these new freshman Republicans, and I know we're going to do more on the Bulwark about them. But Madison Cawthorn, what's her
Mm-hmm.
name, Green, the QAnon congresswoman, another QAnon, adjacent congresswoman from Colorado. This new guy that beat Denver Riggle. I mean, you have people who make Matt Gaetz look like Cicero in comparison. You have Tommy Tuberville going to be coming in sitting next to Marsha Blackburn, and I mean it's there's the Trumpification of the Republican Party. Is starting to take roots. I mean, you're seeing what's happening to the Republican Party in Texas, run by Alan West, talking about secession, or Kelly Ward, who's the chairman of the Republican Party in Arizona, who is just completely out of her mind. So, I mean, there is a dangerous trajectory, but I want to get your take on this. You take Donald Trump out of this; he's no longer the president. He leaves in disgrace. Don't you think there is room for at least some quasi the residual sane elements of the party to make a little bit of noise?
Oh, I think there's definitely room for it. The problem is, so this goes to, I've been doing sort of an end of year review. I do this every year where I go over everything I've written in my own newsletter. Put a little plug in there, tracinskiletter.com.
Hmm.
My own newsletter that I
Highly
that I do. I
recommended.
do a lot of coverage, a lot of different things, and I do things for the Bulwark, but this is I do a lot of other things there. And I do an end of year review, and the thing that struck me, because it's something that I hadn't really noticed until I got it, I'll put it all together, is I'm concerned there's a kind of a de-alignment going on in the
Hmm.
on I would say in the Republican Party, but more broadly in what we call the political right. And by what I mean by
De-alignment.
de-alignment is, yeah, there are these big political alignments we have, So if we were a European parliamentary democracy where it's possible for small parties, right, to survive, we would have like six different political parties, and our politics would be, these alignments would be much more visible because it would be alliances between all these little minority parties, fragmentary parties, who align together to do things as coalitions in the government. But because we have a system we have, which really sort of herds everybody into these two major parties, what we have is each major party represents a kind of ideological alignment or ideological coalition. And the traditional ideological coalition of the right and of the Republican Party has been the hawks, the free marketers, and the religious
Hmm.
conservatives, the religious traditionalists. And the Trump era, I think, has sort of is partly a product of and is pushing a de-alignment of that coalition. So that was, that coalition was formed actually very deliberately back in the 50s. National Review championed this thing that was called fusionism, right?
Hmm.
The idea that these three parties, these three factions could all get along, and by working together and pursuing our objectives, each was helping the other.
And by
And
the way, because you're right about this, but also that project recognized the fact that these factions had real fundamental differences. And before the National Review Fusionist project, it did seem like that many of those differences were irreconcilable, right? I mean, how do you get the libertarians together with the social conservatives? How do you reconcile some of these different values? So, to a certain extent, those real fundamental differences have been papered over for a very, very long time and are now reemerging,
and I
right?
think the thing is, ideological coalitions like that last for so long that
Right.
they become regarded as just the way things are.
Yeah.
It's part of the landscape. Are you going to be a conservative or a liberal? Are you going to be a Republican or a Democrat? these ideological alignments seem natural, and they can also have weird distorting effects too, because I was talking about, the left paying the price for not standing up to its nutcases, and they did kind of stand up to the nutcases. But notice how political coalitions have a corrupting effect, because when you see somebody as being on your side, as being part of your coalition, you tend to be very muted and cautious and timid in your criticism of them, because you don't want to be fighting with your own people, because that makes you weak in fighting with the other coalition. So that's why you have a lot of Democrats who would sort of say timid, moderate, cautious criticism and distance themselves from the rioting, but didn't really want to anger the flying monkeys on their side, who are the people who say, yes, looting is good. And so
But why do Republicans not pay the same price for the Proud Boys and the militias and the guys that show up, at the Michigan State Capitol with the, AK-47s or whatever?
I think that the last election was an interesting one, because I think what happened is people split their ticket, and people made these differentiations where they blamed. It's like they blamed Democrats down the ticket for the riots, but they didn't blame Joe Biden. Mm-hmm. And they blamed but on the other hand, they blamed Donald Trump for all the rotten stuff he's done, but they didn't really blame Republicans in Congress. So it was a very oddly split decision that they made.
It was an oddly split decision. So when you talk about the de-alignment, but where do the different alignments go if, in fact, American politics is going to continue to be a binary choice?
Well, so I think that what we have is a de-alignment where it's very clear that the nationalist wing of the right, which has sort of taken Trump as his figurehead, they are done with the libertarian wing, with the pro-free market wing. They want to basically say to hell with those people. Let's get rid of them. We don't need them. They're hostile to what we stand for. And this is sort of Tucker Carlson thing. Tucker Carlson getting on the TV talking about how much he likes Elizabeth Warren's program, and how we should, the right should embrace Elizabeth Warren's program as the right economics, but combine it with social conservatism. So they're basically done being in a coalition with the pro-free marketers, and a lot of us are sort of returning the favor and not wanting to be in a coalition with them. So we have a de-alignment, but we don't yet have a realignment. And that's the interesting question, is that, and it's one that I kind of want to explore, which is to what extent, because I think there's also the material for a de-alignment on the left of center side, because you've had all this stuff about cancel culture, and you've had a whole sort of people who remembered they were supposed to be liberals, and that liberals are supposed to be for free speech. And so you had that whole side that's been in rebellion against the woke left. And so there's a question there, and we've seen this sort of temporary alliance of convenience, of which the Bulwark sort of has featured some of that temporary alliance of convenience between the sort of liberal or the pro-freedom right, or the center right, and the center left. And I'm wondering to what extent that will potentially cause something of a realignment eventually, or whether that will sort of fade into the background as let's say Trump fades from the scene and we go back to the status quo ante of 20th century fusionism.
No, and I think all of that is up in the air, and in part that means that people are free to pursue some of their ideas, to the extent that our politics are about ideas anymore. Yeah. Won't the right in some of this de-alignment, won't that be healed by just going back into the default setting of being oppositional to whatever the Democrats do or a Biden administration does?
I think to some extent that is
all the factions will be reunited in being reactionary.
Opposition is the health of the Republican Party in a way,
right?
In an odd way, because yes, I mean the Obama years were great years for the Republican Party because we could all agree we didn't like this guy, right? We could all agree that or at least we could all agree that we opposed his policies, whatever you thought of him personally. Yeah. And I was looking back too recently at some of the things I wrote about Barack Obama, and it's like next to Trump, you tend to get this sort of hazy recollection, hazy golden glow on the past of how much better it was. And I look back at some of the stuff that I was criticizing Obama for. I'm like, yeah, he was actually a pretty bad president. He did a lot of stuff I really didn't like on foreign policy. He was very negligent. He loved to govern to try to govern by executive order. and nobody seems to have learned the lesson of how much trouble that can cause.
See, I'm actually going in the opposite direction, realizing that a lot of the things that we said back then were so overheated, were sort of overwrought. And I agree with you, by the way, on the whole executive order thing. On the other hand, once you had, Mitch McConnell essentially saying that he's not going to, cooperate in any way. Well, this is where water flows, and we're going to see this in every presidency. I think it's at some
Yeah.
point. I do think that one of the things that happened was that the right became so in love with its own rhetorical critiques of Obama that we weren't actually noticing that there was a Venn diagram that we could have agreed on things. And so I've actually been reading Obama's book, believe it or not, and realizing that, okay, here's where we fundamentally disagree on certain things. But you know what? Under the circumstances, while we were screaming about socialism and death panels and everything, we were kind of not engaging in a good faith debate. And I think that, that's contributed to this sort of Flight 93 election motif, that we have to burn it all down because the other side is so malign and they hate, that rhetorical critique of Obama was so divorced from reality that it did morph into what we have now.
Well,
At
actually,
least that's where I'm at.
my view is I think the people who got a really bad rap from the Obama years were the Republican establishment. Because looking back now, I realize that the biggest blow made for the cause of small government in the last decade was the sequester. John Boehner going in there and negotiating with Obama and negotiating very toughly with Obama, very strongly negotiated. I try to use the proper Trumpian terms, and actually got the only time and I can recall in the last 20 years that federal spending has remained the same or has remained level or gone slightly down. What an enormous accomplishment that seems like in retrospect, because it's the only time it's happened in the last in more than 20 years.
But that, of course, assumes that the Republican Party or the Republican base actually cares about small government or
That's right.
cares about fiscal conservatism, because this is one of my great disillusionments, because I really did think there was that moment. And what we've seen over the last 4 years is they just threw it under the bus. I have to say, watching my former friend, Ron Johnson, now saying he's really concerned about deficit spending after the last 4 years is one of those irony is dead again.
Yeah.
So I do have trouble wrestling with what was the Tea Party all about, because it was clearly not about deficit reduction and paying down the debt and small government, was it?
Well, actually, see, I defend the Tea Party a little bit, partly because I knew.
If the Tea Party morphs into Trumpism, I'm talking about the Tea Party as it exists now, what it's morphed into.
Well, that's the question, isn't it? Because I'm not sure the
Yeah.
Tea Party morphed into Trumpism. I think it's not necessarily the same group of people. I think there's some overlap. Some of them are the same people, but a lot of them aren't. I view the Tea Party as sort of a rapprochement between the other wings of conservatism and the pro-free marketers and the libertarians, sort of a conservative libertarian rapprochement that happened for a brief period there for a couple of years. And that's why this is weird whipsaw, that it went from being, the Tea Party movement really was a movement where I personally benefited from this. So I think in retrospect, I realized part of the reason, I got a boost from my career by being picked up at the Federalist in its early years when the Federalist was this fast growing, exciting new thing. Let's not talk about what it has become since then.
Wow. Yeah. No,
But
we all have a past, Robert.
well, there's this moment for a couple of years there where it was this sort of, a variety of different voices from different wings of the right. And, before Trump came along and everything got to be realigned around one person, there was this moment that the Federalists had. And then, of course, that got wrecked. But I got a boost from my career for that. And in retrospect, I realized I got picked up because I was considered, because it was 2014, and I was considered somebody who was sort of a Tea Party type of guy. And that was the ascendant wing of the movement. Right. So
Right.
there was this moment where being somebody like that, you talked to me about me being a conservative commentator. I've never really called myself a conservative because I'm not religious. I'm a secular free marketer. Right. So I'm more of the libertarian. I don't call myself a libertarian either because I'm too much of a hawk. So I don't really fit it neatly into the categories. But the point is that I was on this more sort of radical pro-free market, libertarianish end of things. and somebody like me could, be picked up and have, there were a lot, it was a world of opportunities when that was considered to be the ascendant. The Tea Party was considered to be the ascendant movement on the political right. So there's this weird sort of whipsaw, of course, that we got that
Right.
6 years later, six or 7 years after the rise of the Tea Party movement, everything would go so much in the other direction. But I think that's because the sort of rapprochement between conservatives and libertarians, that was what was torn apart, and a bunch of the conservatives decided, no, we want to go the nationalist conservative.
I'm a little more cynical about it because I do think that the grifting the grifting aspect of this is was really on display with the Tea Party, that you had certain grassroots elements that may have been genuinely concerned about the size of government, but eventually people found a way to monetize this, organize this.
Oh yeah,
A lot of organizations that took on the title of the Tea Party were very easily morphed into Trump because it was always about the grift. It was always about the con, and you still see some of these folks around doing all of this. So let me just move on, because I want to ask you, get your take on another story that's in the news today, and I have to admit that I have really mixed feelings about it. There's strong feelings, but they're mixed, if that makes any sense.
sure.
I'm watching all of these United States senators, the Marco Rubios and the Joni Ernst. Like Joni Ernst, for example, a senator from Iowa who, not too long ago was suggesting that doctors are faking coronavirus deaths to make money. And there she is. She's jumping in front of the line there and getting a vaccine. And they're all, doing this on television, while a lot of frontline workers have not gotten this vaccine, but politicians are. What is your take on this?
Well, on the one hand, there's good evidence that politicians, on no matter where they stand, by the way, in terms of what they publicly say about the coronavirus, politicians are super spreaders. They really are. I mean, yeah, and it's not just Joni Ernst. It's not just
True.
people who deny, or people who have said things denying the extent of the coronavirus. It's like Gavin Newsom, right, going out and saying, "Well, everybody else has to lock down, but I'm going to a party at a wine restaurant, Napa Valley restaurant."
Yeah.
So
Great.
politicians, they're schmoozers, and nothing is more important to them than getting together and shaking hands and talking to people, face to face. And they are super spreaders. So on the one hand, I'm almost glad that they're getting this vaccine, so because maybe we could contain some of the spread that way. But yeah, there is this incredible sort of. I mean, the tragedy of this last year is we had a major public health emergency, and everybody turned it into or not everybody, but a lot of people basically turned it into just another football in the culture wars. We actually had a public health culture war, and it's the most insane and destructive thing you could possibly have. And there were a lot of
It is.
people who are responsible for feeding into that and going along with that and not standing up against, and at the very least, not standing up against it. And now those people are lining up, oh, I'm going to get the vaccine first. And you kind of, yeah, I think I agree with your mixed feelings that you kind of want to say, no, you should be
Right.
last in line.
On the other hand, I would prefer that they did it than that they, drifted off into the anti-vax stuff, because we're going to have a vax, an anti-vaxxer culture war next year as well. So I guess I'd rather have Joni Ernst be pro-vax than join in the crazy. But on the other hand, it's just the way the system is rigged, sort of the
Yeah.
inequality and the inequity of it, that does gall. And
Well,
I linked to a story in my newsletter, just want to mention this, that piece in the Washington Post just haunts the hell out of me. And it asks the question, why Americans are numb to the staggering coronavirus death toll. And it mentions that, human beings basically will react to one starving child, but if you show them a picture of 1,000
yeah.
starving children, they kind of shut down. That this has been invisible, and we kind of shrug it up. But 400,000 deaths is amazing. And this story's got a description of what it is like to die of coronavirus alone, without your loved ones around you, with no human touch. I mean, just this absolute nightmare. And we're getting close to 400,000 Americans dying this way. And to watch the people turning this into a joke or a political football is one of the great outrages of our time. I mean, the people who are raging against social distancing, who make a joke of some of the some of the rules and the recommendations, including masks and everything. I mean, it is a real tragedy. And you know that some of these politicians have played on that. You have Ted Cruz out there saying that the coronavirus was going to disappear the day after the election. I'm sorry, Ted, shut the fuck up. Now, he's had the good judgment, at least for the time being, not to jump ahead of the line and get the vaccine. But he's going to, and he's going to get it in front of a lot of doctors and nurses in this country.
Well, the thing is that we're all used to the fact that politics, there's a certain fakery in politics, right? That politicians will go out and say things. I mean, the old term is bunkum, right? The origin of that, the term bunkum, comes from Congress. It came from a congressman who represented Buncombe County down in like Kentucky or something like that. And he gave some prolificating speech on the floor of Congress that made no difference and was totally irrelevant to anything. And somebody said, "Why did you give that speech?" Well, I said, "Well, I had to say something for Buncombe." And that's where bunkum came to refer to something that's totally fake. And this is like, 19th century. So this is not a new phenomenon. So we're used to politicians being fake and posturing and all of that. And we kind of, those of us in the business kind of get a little cynical about that. And of course, they will say, make all these very bold statements and strong statements. And then behind the scenes, they don't believe any of it. But when it comes to an issue that is so much of a direct, immediate life and death issue as this, where the consequences and the scientific truth and the consequences are so well established and clear cut, that's when we sort of complacency about that. It really makes you realize how serious it really is.
No, it is serious. And going back to your comment before about Donald Trump's self-interest, if he was actually thinking about his self-interest, if he actually was thinking about running for president, he would have wrapped himself around this vaccine from the beginning. He would be talking about it. He would be making public appearances about it. And the fact is that he cannot bring himself to get out of his sulk.
You may remember that in May, his approval ratings were going up. I think it was April or May. His approval ratings were going up because there's this rally around the flag effect. And if he had been, "I'm going to be the president who led you boldly through this coronavirus by telling you the truth and by working on and touting on how I'm going to work on," and not just a vaccine, because the vaccine it was always clear that it was going to take a while, but things like contact tracing and massive large scale testing, all these things that people were saying, in March and April, we need to do this. They put the presidential son-in-law, Jared. They put Jared in charge of this little task force to do all this.
What a cluster!
But they had a whole plan, and then the whole thing just was. It wasn't that they tried and failed to do it. They had a whole plan they put together. There's a great report about this a while back. They had a whole plan to do massive testing and get all this online and make it available. And then the president lost interest, and it was just dropped, and it never went anywhere.
President lost interest. I don't know whether you've seen this, but how crazy our times are. That Geraldo Rivera has become the voice of reason on Fox News. That he's on basically saying, "You people, it's over. This election is done. Stop indulging this." He was actually on with Charlie Kirk, who's become just thoroughly embarrassing on so many different levels. Mm-hmm. But Geraldo Rivera is flashing the reality sign, but feels the need to soften the blow by saying maybe we could induce Donald Trump to do something marginally gracious by naming the vaccine after Donald Trump, which is one of the stupidest ideas in the world, but also shows this instinct or this obsession with catering to Donald Trump's disordered personality. It is this, come on, Donald, we'll give you a piece of candy, take you to the zoo, if you don't call out the military. It's like, no, it's like the worst thing on earth you could do is to name this the Trump vaccine if you want 70% of Americans to take it. So Geraldo, who's the voice of reason, has to come up with this completely batshit stupid idea.
Well, that's your problem. There is Geraldo as the voice of reason. That's right. Just not going to work as a whole. But that goes back to this issue of what Republicans are doing with when Trump he's in this little bubble of this alternate reality where he really won the election. He won it hugely. He won it by a big margin, and it was stolen from him because of the voting machines or whatever conspiracy theories he's picking up from these people. And the thing about most Republicans, though, I think it's very clear to me, they're desperate for him to be gone. They want him to be gone. They cannot wait. They're counting not just the days, they're counting the hours before he's out of office, and they don't have to do this. They don't have to humiliate themselves all the time. But they have so much of the sort of battered woman syndrome, right? That
Oh, yeah.
that the one time they hate him, but the other time they're deathly afraid of him, and they're deathly afraid of this fanatical faction of the right that he commands, that will come, and the flying monkeys, as we keep calling them, that they desperately want him to go on, but they won't do a single thing to make it happen.
Yeah, I know. I think that's exactly where we're at. And they're just sort of hoping that he will go away. But of course, that's what they hoped throughout 2015 and 2016. And you think nothing has changed there. I fear you are right. I hope you
Well,
are.
so
So,
my biggest concern is this. I was talking a while back to George Will, and he said, well, he has this, for a guy who describes himself as being pessimistic, he had a very optimistic take, which is that, well, they have these very strong conservative institutions, all these think tanks, and all these writers and all these thinkers, and after Trump is gone and fades from the scene, they will reassert themselves, and we'll see the right go back to where it traditionally has been. And I think a lot of people are depending on that. They're counting on that
mm,
after this is all over, the traditional right as we remember it from the Reagan era, the Reagan right is going to come back.
yeah, I think that's
And
unlikely.
I'm just not optimistic about that. I'm
Yeah.
not really sure. I think that there was, that there's this long political alignment that was lasted for about 70 years. I'm not sure that political alignment is all just going to heal itself back together.
I can think of only a handful of think tanks that have not utterly and thoroughly disgraced themselves over the last 4 years and whose credibility has been shredded. I will say, though, that if you're looking for green shoots in terms of like institutional strength, I think by the time this is over, we'll look back and say, hey, you know what? The military actually performed well and was a bulwark of democracy. The courts, surprisingly,
Mhm.
were very, very strong on this. We're getting a lesson in what a conservative conservative justice actually did. So the courts, the military, one hopes that Congress would do it. Local officials, local state officials, legislators did not go along with all of this. I think that's really extraordinary that there's not a single judge in this country that is going along with Trump's attempt to overturn this election. Not a single legislature has gone along with this. Not a single governor, not a single secretary of state, nowhere
Well,
has,
it's
so I mean that's a positive sign, right?
it's the Republican election officials who are the heroes here. But see, here's my
They are.
concern though, is those people were basically selected in the pre-Trump era.
Right.
And what is it going to look like when it comes time again to appoint state and local level election officials? When it comes time to appoint or elect those people in the next 4 years, what's going to happen? Who's going to be engaged on that? What if the QAnon people and the stolen election conspiracy theory people? What if they're the ones who are engaged and on target in looking at these
Well,
these local decisions? So we could be seeing the momentum of the past of the Republican Party in what happened in this election, and who knows what mischief will be caused in the future if people are actually engaged, and if there's a conspiracy theory group that is really motivated to get out and influence these the local elections for or appointments for election officials.
no, this is a very, very good point because just imagine the discussion we would be having now if you had one of those Trumpian officials, say, who had been instead of Mr. Raffensperger in Georgia, if it had been a QAnon guy in Georgia, or imagine if the governor of Arizona was Kelly Ward rather than Doug Ducey, we'd be having a very, very different discussion now. Robert Tracinski, thank you so much for coming on the podcast, and because Donald Trump is still president, we can still say Merry Christmas. So I hope you and your family have a great Christmas and the holiday season.
Merry Christmas to you too.
And thank you for listening to today's Bulwark Podcast. I'm Charlie Sykes. We will be back tomorrow, and we will do this all over again.